All right, well, since everybody's here, we may as well just go ahead and get started. Does anybody have any questions about anything before we start today? Everybody good? Okay. All right, so today we're going to be talking about Plato's Gorgias. How did this go for you? What did you guys think of this? Something a little deeper than that, but yeah, right now I'm just looking for responses. We don't have to be too analytical yet. Like, in particular, I'm looking for, like, if there was stuff that really interested you or stuff that really confused you, stuff that bugged you.
Socrates, just the way he's going on, that's always irritating.
Okay. Well, give me an example. What's irritating about Socrates going on and on?
I guess because, he doesn't really, he was Plato writing this, but
yeah.
Socrates was speaking.
Socrates is the character through which he speaks, yeah.
But you know how, like, Socrates, he doesn't really say what he's thinking. He says what he's thinking, but he doesn't, say his point of view. He just keeps asking a question.
Yeah.
You can tell he has his point of view in mind when he's asking the question.
Yeah.
Isn't that the Socratic method anyway?
Yeah, the questions he asks are leading questions, right?
I guess to make you come to the realization yourself.
Yeah. It's clear that he has an end in mind, right? That he's trying to get Gorgias or whoever else he's interviewing in any other dialogue to come to, yeah. But the questioning is the method, right? So it comes off as irritating, but, we have to remember, too, that, this was a guy who the citizens of Athens voted to execute. So...
Because it wouldn't shut up?
Well, they're specifically, he was executed for corrupting the youth of Athens with his teachings. He was actually held responsible for the actions of one of his students, a guy named Alcibiades. Alcibiades was elected a general by the Athenian assembly, betrayed Athens, went to their enemy Sparta, was caught in bed with the king of Sparta's wife, and so had to flee Sparta back to Athens. And then I believe eventually ended up taking up with the Persians. So the argument in the Athenian assembly was that Socrates' teachings were responsible for Alcibiades' actions. And so they voted to essentially forced Socrates to die by suicide. Right? He was to drink hemlock and thus put himself to death. So one of the things that to note about that is that this directly informs, like this particular episode, what happened to his teacher, directly informs a lot of Plato's views. While Socrates was annoying to the citizens of Athens, he wasn't put to death because he was annoying.
Right.
There are still, any society in which somebody can be put to death merely for being irritating is not a just society.
So, was that the only person who did anything like that?
Well,
you did get more than one chance.
Well, it was a pretty big one.
I see that. But if the other guys didn't do it, probably doesn't correlate like.
Well, it's kind of like when we talked about that Judas Priest album in the first class.
Yeah, right.
Two people who bought that album subsequently shot themselves many years after it was actually released, right? Over a decade after the album actually came out. Whereas, the other, millions of people who bought that album did not shoot themselves. So is the band then to be held responsible for the actions of two people?
Right.
We're talking about a smaller number of people here in ancient Athens, but
I mean, because you can't really, like, someone can't really persuade you to do something.
Uh-huh.
It's ultimately your choice
You
to,
have
like, go
free
sleep
will.
with somebody that you shouldn't be
Uh-huh.
sleeping with.
But if we talk about rhetoric, right, we're talking about rhetoric, which is what we are talking about today, right?
Rhetoric.
What is rhetoric?
Isn't that like I would say like speech or like some kind of like a message speech?
Okay, yeah,
How one
It's like a question that can't be answered is what I think of. Rhetoric.
speech or language is part of it. I think you're thinking of a rhetorical question, right?
Yeah, what happened?
So, and several of you have probably already seen me mark on your assignments, right? Avoid rhetorical questions. Why do I want you to avoid rhetorical questions? What is a rhetorical question?
it's a question that isn't meant to be answered, or the writer isn't explaining.
Yeah.
Makes you think about it in your own way.
Yeah, it's asked to achieve a particular effect, right? Not to get an answer. So say, I am an Athenian general in the 5th century BCE, and you are all my troops, and I'm trying to get you psyched up, and I say, are we not twice the fighters the Spartans are? And there's an assumed answer, right?
Yeah.
Yes, we are twice the fighters the Spartans are, but the purpose here is not for you to answer the question or for me to answer the question, right? The answer to the question is already known. And what the asker is trying to do is kind of state the obvious without stating the obvious, right? To achieve a particular persuasive effect. So rhetoric is often but not always concerned with speech and language. What else? What other associations do you have with the word rhetoric?
I guess action.
Okay, that someone might be trying to cause particular actions, right?
Right.
So, what about from this piece? Like, did you get any sense of what is meant by rhetoric from reading Plato's piece? I mean, about 2/3 of this is caught up with Plato trying to get Gorgias to give him a definition, right?
Well, I mean, with his rhetorical questions, he was asking, well, the leading questions,
Uh-huh.
a lot of them were also rhetorical.
Yeah.
To let him think about the answers.
Yeah. Although, one thing to remember with Socrates is that most of his questions, even if he already has an answer in mind, right, he does expect Gorgias to respond, right? He does expect an answer from Gorgias.
Oh, okay.
So generally when we talk about rhetoric, what we are talking about is persuasion. Usually through speech and language, although visual rhetoric is also a thing, right? People can and often do use images to persuade. Like, for example, you're driving down the highway, you see a billboard, right? The billboard is trying to convince you that it's a good idea to stop at McDonald's, right? Or that, hey, maybe you need your car washed right now, right? Or, hey, maybe you want to rent this billboard. So they will often use a particular combination of words and pictures to try to get a point across or to persuade you of something. The key element in rhetoric typically is this element of persuasion. And much of our use of language is, at least on some level, persuasive, right? Or is intended on some level to be persuasive, to get you to listen, to get you to do something, to get you to believe something, right? So, to give you an example, right? What do I put up on the board every day before you come to class?
So put away your phones or electronic devices.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, so let's just look for a second at the way that I frame this. Do I have, what elements of this sentence do I not need to get you to do what I want?
You don't need to say please and thank you. You could just say put away your phones.
Yeah, I don't have to say please and thank you, right? I can just tell you and expect you to obey because I'm the authority figure in the room, right? So why do I say please and thank you instead?
Because it'll make us want to do it more.
Yeah.
As opposed to just
It's one of those things, you know.
Yeah, because like if I'm commanding you, right, you'll still do it because I can make you do it, right?
Awaken the inner rebel.
We won't do it.
Yeah,
I don't want to.
you'll do it grudgingly, right?
Yeah, right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah, you'll resent that you have to do it more. Whereas if I ask you politely, then even if I can enforce it, right, it still feels more voluntary on your part, yes? Or it's intended to feel more voluntary on your part, right? You're not being coerced, you're cooperating. And I am expressing appreciation as well to get you to, I say please to make you feel like you're cooperating, and then thank you to express appreciation in advance for your cooperation, right? Because I'd rather you do this willingly than that you know, sigh and stomp your feet and moan and, you know, then try to sneak glances at your phone, you know, every 5 minutes, right? Yeah, I've generally found that students are less likely to try to break the rule if I don't frame it as a rule. So yeah, this is rhetoric, right? If we look at like one of the most common examples of like obvious rhetoric we find in any culture is political speech, right? And the way candidates frame their speech often tells you a lot kind of, like, it is purposeful, right? Much of what they're doing is purposeful, although in subtle ways. So if we think back to the unpleasantness of 2016. In the Democratic primary, right, there were two major candidates, right? Hillary Rodham Clinton, former senator from New York, former Secretary of State, former First Lady, right? And Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, former mayor of Burlington, former member of the House of Representatives, right? At-large member for Vermont before he was a senator. So, you know, both people with, you know, long experience in government, right? The way they spoke about their plans and their policies differed in one very important way. And it was the use of the first person pronoun. Hillary Clinton's speeches included the word I much more frequently. Bernie Sanders' speeches were more likely to frame the first person as we. Now, what are those different uses of the first person pronoun indicating? Or what would they indicate to an audience about how this candidate wants you to perceive them?
I think the we is more of like almost like a team player type thing, you know. It's
Okay.
like I'm not going to do it. Like I'm not going to take total control. Like we're going to all do this together, not just me do it.
Okay, stressing cooperation and group identity, right? Okay, what about the I?
She's saying that she's going to be the one to do it, like I'm going to be the one to do this, to pass these laws, and etc.
Yeah, taking kind of personal responsibility
Yeah, that's the word.
for everything, right? Right. It's on me to do this, or I will be doing this. I will be the one who is responsible for all of this, right? So, the weird thing about this is the way it actually reverses the usual gender polarity of speech. Usually women are more likely to use we, and men are more likely to speak in terms of I. So how might we read that? Is it necessarily that either candidate is trying to appear more feminine or more masculine?
No.
Yeah, certainly, probably not intentionally, right?
Yeah.
In fact, I mean, like, if we think of, like, sort of what is Bernie Sanders' kind of stated political ideology? Like, what political ideas does he espouse? Like, what's his...
Democratic socialist?
Yeah, he calls him, he refers to himself as a democratic socialist, right?
Right.
Right. The key word there being social, right? That it is primarily about groups working together. Now, why might Hillary Clinton have used the word I so much then?
Well, she's not a democratic socialist, or doesn't proclaim to be.
Okay, she's not a democratic socialist and never claimed to be. But there are also gendered reasons for this, right? And it has to do with the way audiences and voters perceive candidates of particular genders, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't help that she was already first lady, so it's like
Right.
she doesn't want to be in that shadow.
Yeah, and she is the first woman to be selected as a candidate by either major party, right?
Yeah.
So men are often judged in terms of potential achievement. In job interviews, things like this, there's a lot of sociological research to back this up. While women are often judged in terms of what they've already done. Right? Not can you do this job, but have you already proven that you can do this job, right? So one of the reasons that they might be using different first-person pronouns here, rhetorically, is that there are different expectations laid on both of them, right? That they can't use the same means to persuade even the same voters, right? The same audience, right? That public perception actually does play a role in this, right? So how many have ever seen this diagram before? Or are familiar with these terms? What do these terms mean?
It's like supposed to be like logic,
Emotions and ethics.
Yeah, these are the root words for our words logic and ethics, right? So pathos is the appeal to the emotions. So anytime you're doing anything in a speech or a piece of writing where you're trying to get an emotional response from your audience, that's pathos, right? If you tell a heart-wrenching story about your difficult childhood, or even if you tell a joke, right? That's pathos, right? Anything that's designed to elicit an emotional response. So what about logos? What is that?
logical.
Yeah, specifically the appeal to reason, right? Logos means the appeal to reason. So if you were trying to make a logical appeal to someone, if you're trying to use logos in an argument, what sorts of things would you be doing?
Like maybe stating like facts, or like some kind of research.
Yeah, facts, data, figures, right? Arrangement is also part of this, right? You want your facts and data and figures to go together.
Don't commercially use logos to kind of like sell a product and stuff like that, or?
Commercials will often use a combination of all three.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, most good rhetoric, or most effective rhetoric, let me say, often involves a combination of all three appeals. In your academic writing, pathos is largely going to be kind of de-emphasized, right? We're not interested in you making us feel the feelings. We're more interested in how well you reason and ethos. Now, what is ethos? What is ethos the appeal to?
Ethics.
Ethics is the word we get from it, right? But what does it mean? What does it mean to be ethical?
Isn't that like almost like moral, or like?
It's similar to moral,
It's
right?
Like right, I guess.
Right and
Not
wrong.
necessarily.
Is that what you're gonna have, right?
It's like if something is like, when I think something is unethical, it's like not orthodox.
Yeah, when we're talking about
Unorthodox.
something that's unethical, right? Then we're talking about something that usually kind of violates a code, right?
Correct.
So like most professions, have a code of ethics. Or there's a code of ethics for teachers. There's a code of ethics for doctors. There's a code of ethics for lawyers, so on and so forth, right? And violating that code, like, doing something dishonest typically, right? Or doing something potentially harmful is what we regard as unethical, right? So someone who is ethical is someone who is of good character and reputation. So ethos is the appeal to character and reputation, right? So you demonstrate ethos by showing that you're knowledgeable about the subject, by showing that you have the proper credentials and to put in the proper time and study to speak about the subject, by showing that you have your audience's best interest at heart, and by citing sources responsibly. Right? That's key for your establishment of ethos, right? And the reason I saved ethos for last year is that, in a sense, these are both ethos arguments, right? This use of the first person pronoun. They're both making an argument about character. Right? Sanders is saying, like, I don't put myself above you, right? I'm down in the trenches with you. Clinton's saying, I am prepared for this job, I am ready to do this job, and will fight for you, right?
Right.
Having to prove yourself.
Yeah. But essentially, both of these come down to arguments about character. And they're both intended to be positive arguments about character, right? So, let's backtrack a little bit. Now we've got some, a stronger sense of maybe what rhetoric is, and talk about the context from which it arises. It's actually kind of worthwhile, I think, to talk about politics before we look at the origins of rhetoric, because that's really kind of where it comes from. So, do any of you know anything about, not just about ancient Greece in general, but about 5th century Athens more specifically, about the system of government?
I need a refresher on that.
Does anybody know what was unusual in the ancient world about the government of the city-state of Athens?
I mean, I can make some guess, but
I was going to say, I need to refresh me on that one.
Can you make an educated guess?
See, that's where you got
Ryland, I'm sorry, Ryland, what did you say? Yes, Ryland has got it. It was a direct democracy. So what this meant was, right, every free male citizen who had reached the age of majority voted on decisions of public importance, right? Should we go to war with Sparta? Everybody gets a vote. Should we impose tariffs on our trade with Corinth? Everybody gets a vote. Should we execute Socrates, right? Everybody gets a vote. And so in a system like this, where there are no hereditary or appointed or even elected leaders, what do you need to be able to do in order to sway things the way you want them? What do you have to be able to do to convince people to take any kind of collective action?
persuade them, like, start a riot or something? Or like,
Not start a riot. It's slightly alarming. It's slightly alarming how quickly your brain jumped to that.
It's like, you want change, revolution?
Yeah. No, we're not talking about, like, government through the starting of riots. But we are talking about government that worked primarily through persuasion, right?
Right. They're trying to persuade the masses.
Yeah.
If everyone gets a vote, then you persuade everyone, not just,
Exactly,
a certain
yeah.
party of people.
Yeah, you have to come up with arguments that will persuade enough people to get them to vote for it, right? if I want to, repair the harbor or whatever, right? I've got to get, in order to get the funds for that, I have to get enough people to vote for it.
Right.
So I have to make a good case for it. So rhetoric develops as a formal system, develops directly out of this environment. In fact, there are teachers of rhetoric who call themselves sophists. Sophia in ancient Greek means wisdom. So a sophist is a wise one. And these sophists would charge tuition, mostly from relatively wealthy families. And they would teach persuasive speech to young men. And it wasn't just, it was primarily speech that they taught, but not just speech. They would teach you how to discourse knowledgeably on a variety of different subjects. They would teach you how to properly pitch your voice to achieve particular rhetorical effects. They would teach you what gestures you should make to make particular points, what stances you should be in that were most persuasive, right? So there was a physical element to much of this as well. And they would teach you essentially simply how to argue your point, right? Now, most of these sophists seemed to subscribe to a couple of general beliefs about life, the universe, and everything. Right? One, that absolute truth, if it exists, is unknowable. Right? If there is any such thing as absolute truth, human beings can't comprehend it. So the best thing that we can do, the closest we can come to truth, is making persuasive arguments. Right? The most persuasive argument is probably going to end up being closest to the truth. That is what the sophists believed. And Gorgias, Socrates' opponent in this dialogue, was one of the leading sophists in Athens. Now, one of the slightly ironic things about the sophists is that most of them were foreigners. They were not native-born Athenians, so they weren't themselves actually allowed to vote in the assembly. But they could teach other people how to win their point. Now, do you guys know anything about Plato? Have any of you studied Plato? Have you had to read Plato for other classes?
I don't think so. I don't remember.
Okay.
Isn't he a student of Socrates?
Yes, Plato was a student of Socrates, and Aristotle, who we're reading for next time, was a student of Plato. So there is a kind of direct chain there. Where was I going with this? Okay, so Plato. Plato is at odds with the sophists and the way the sophists see the world. So in his longest and best known book, it's called the Republic. If you have to take it, if you have to take intro to political science, you will probably end up having to read the Republic, or at least parts of it. But he sets up a scenario in the Republic that he calls the allegory of the cave. Is this ringing a bell for somebody? You remember this? What do you remember about it, Grace?
Is this the one where he's in the cave and like he's facing the wall and there's a bunch of shadows and stuff, and it's about perception?
Okay, so yeah, you remember some of this too, Rylan. Okay, good. Okay, so this is not. So we're not. Yeah. Okay, so we've got some foundation for this already. All right, good. Do you guys know what an allegory is, by the way?
My mom and boy.
Okay. Yeah, totally all right. An allegory is a story or picture in which everything stands for something else. So everything in an allegory is intended to refer to something outside the allegory, right?
One big symbolic thing.
Yeah, but like it's intentional symbolism, right?
Right.
It's the author or the painter or sculptor or whatever has is making deliberate reference to particular things, right? So the allegory of the cave works thusly. As Grace and Rylan were kind enough to sort of begin for us, you got a cave, right? It's a big cave. And you got prisoners tied up, chained up in the cave, and they are chained in such a way that they can't turn their heads, right? They're forced to look at the back wall. And on this back wall, there are these big projections, right? They see these shadows moving across. And this is all they know of the world, right? This is all they can see. Now, up above them on a little causeway is a fire. And behind the fire, you have a couple of guys waving objects around, right? And unbeknownst to the unfortunates chained up in the cave, what they're seeing is just the shadows of these objects, right? Now, behind these guys waving the objects around in front of the fire is the cave exit, which leads out into the light. And if one of these guys happens to break free, right, he'll run out into the light, and at first, it'll be blinding, right?
Like coming out of a movie theater.
Yeah.
I love that.
But eventually, his eyes will adjust. He'll see things outside the cave as they really are. And he'll want to go back and tell his friends about it. So he goes back into the cave to tell them that there's a whole world out there. And how do you think they respond?
It's not real.
Yeah.
I don't believe them.
They're like, bullshit, look at how great these shadows are, right? So, what the allegory here means, or how we break this down, is that the cave, and in particular the back wall of it, is the world of our senses. All we really see, according to Plato, are shadows, are what he calls ideal forms. Right? Shadows of what he calls ideal forms. Right? Our senses are unreliable. Our senses deceive us. The things that are really real are things of the mind. And that light represents enlightenment, right? It represents the life of the mind. It represents seeing things as they really are. But most people, he argues, are incapable of doing that. And they'll just keep talking, they'll keep talking about the shadows and giving themselves prizes for, saying the smartest things about the shadows and things like that, right? Without focusing on what really matters. So the way this kind of translates to the real world, right, or what we would call the real world, is that everything that we can sense in the world is merely an imitation of an idea. So here I have a table in front of me, right? According to Plato's logic, how can there be a table in the world of the senses? Because I can form an idea of a table, right? And make one. So our senses are always kind of constructing and reconstructing these ideal forms in the world, right? But the table that I can sense isn't the real table. This is just an imitation of that ideal table,
Just a
right?
projection of.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Because the senses are... Yeah, well, the basic idea being, right, the senses are fallible, right?
Right.
And that, in fact, there's no proof that we even all sense the same things.
That's so weird.
Well, there's an 18th century Irish philosopher named George Berkeley who argues that the only things that are real to us are things of the senses, right? And that we have no proof that once we stop sensing something, that it continues to exist. So for example, when we leave this room, right, if none of us are in here, do we still know that the room exists?
Right. That's like if a tree falls in the woods,
Yeah.
No one around here.
If I'm not actually present to your senses at the moment, do you know that I actually exist?
Like a code or something.
Yes, it depends on what kind of extracurricular activities you're
It would
involved
be
in.
like kind of like in like a video game or something. Like if you were like at one stage and once you went to the next, that one wasn't like being processed and ran. Like that one is gone now. All the energy being applied on that.
Yeah, that's actually not a bad way to think of it. Yeah.
There's a lot of theories about
Yeah.
that, exactly.
Yeah, we live in a simulation.
Oh,
I've heard that theory. Yeah. But anyway, how is this relevant to Plato and to the Gorgias? Right? Plato believes that pretty much all arts and sciences have a true form and a false form, right? So, just to divide up things that Socrates mentions in the Gorgias, right? In terms of true and false. Right? Philosophy is true. Right? Philosophy for Plato is the pursuit of truth. Rhetoric, which produces only belief and not knowledge, is false. Medicine is true. Right? Medicine contributes to the health of the body. Cookery, which merely provides you with tasty things to eat, is the false version of medicine. Right? You think it's making you healthy, but it's not. Gymnastics makes the body strong, healthy, and beautiful through effort. Cosmetics makes the body beautiful through painting and trickery, right? So are we seeing how some of the logic here works, right? That everything has a true and a false form, right? And democracy, being a form of government that is based on opinion, for Plato is particularly problematic, right? Because people are governed by belief rather than by truth, rather than by knowledge. So let's start digging a little bit into the Gorgias itself specifically here and see what we can do with this. So what seems to be the major task that Socrates is trying to accomplish for the first several pages? What's he trying to do? Yeah. Yeah, he's trying to get Gorgias to define rhetoric, right? Good. And what's the first definition Gorgias gives him? Yeah, you're thinking along the right tracks here, right? So if we look at the questions Socrates asks, right? About halfway down page 122, he says, very good then. As you profess to be a rhetorician and a maker of rhetoricians, let me ask you, with what is rhetoric concerned? I might ask you, with what is weaving concerned? And you would reply, would you not, with the making of garments? Yes. And music is concerned with the composition of melodies. A little further down. Answer me in like manner about rhetoric, with what is rhetoric concerned? What's the connection Socrates is drawing between weaving and music? How is he suggesting they're alike? Weaving is concerned with the making of garments. Music is concerned with the composition of melodies. How are they alike for Socrates?
It's like, you make it.
They're both involved in the composition of
like-
something.
Yeah, they're both about making something, right? Right. In one case, you're making a physical, tangible object, right? In the other, you're making something intangible. You're just making sounds, right? But both of them involve making something, right? So then what is he asking Gorgias here about rhetoric and about rhetoricians?
So what does that make, or what makes that?
Yeah, what do you make? Yeah. What do you make, Gorgias? And I think you were on the right track there, Alan, when you said words, right? Gorgias says essentially what he makes is discourse. Does everybody understand what discourse is?
Not really. Or I don't.
Okay. Does anybody?
I've heard the word, but I couldn't give you like a flat definition.
Okay, so when you hear like discourse, think like discussion, right?
Okay.
So discourse refers to language, especially language of sort of persuasion and argument. So essentially what he's saying is, I make argumentative language. Now, is this definition good enough for Socrates?
No.
Absolutely not. Right? Why not? What does he point out as problematic about it?
That isn't many other things concerning with discourse as well, like weaving and using it for the art form.
Yeah, the idea of discourse is not exclusive to rhetoric, right? So if we move a little further down here, right, he says, but does not the art of medicine, which we were just now mentioning, also make men able to understand and speak about the sick? Certainly. Then medicine also treats of discourse. Yes, of discourse concerning diseases. Just so. And does not gymnastic also treat of discourse concerning the good or evil condition of the body? Very true. And the same Gorgias is true of the other arts. All of them treat of discourse concerning the subjects with which they severally have to do. So why does it matter that Socrates here picks medicine and gymnastics specifically as bases for comparison to rhetoric? What do they have in common? What do medicine and gymnastics have in common?
Doesn't do with the body.
Yeah, they both have to do with the body, right? And even more specifically,
Physical.
pardon?
Physical health.
Yeah, they have to do with the health of the body. Good, yes. So these other discourses help make and keep people healthy, right?
Right.
So there's an implication here
This does not.
that rhetoric doesn't, right? That rhetoric maybe makes society sick, right? So what's Gorgias' response here? Why does he say that these arts are not rhetoric or are inferior to rhetoric? How are medicine and gymnastics for Gorgias different from rhetoric?
He said that they're physical, and rhetoric is just. He said that they, like, medicine and gymnastics, they take in like action.
Yeah.
And rhetoric is just treats it just like discussion, words.
Yeah, rhetoric is only concerned with language, right? It takes action only through language, not through physical action, right? And then, how does Socrates continue to press him on this? Can I get somebody to read bottom of page 123, where it says, "But there are other arts which work wholly through the medium of language."
But there are other arts which work wholly through the medium of language and require either no action or very little, as for example, the arts of arithmetic, of calculation, of geometry, and of playing draws. In some of these, each is pretty nearly coextensive with action, but in most of them, the verbal element is greater. They depend wholly on words for their efficacy and power. I take your meaning to be that rhetoric is an art of this latter sort.
So here he cites arithmetic, calculation, geometry. What are these branches of?
Curriculum.
Mathematics, yes. So this is relevant in that we need to think about how sophists regard the idea of absolute truth. How would Gorgias feel about the idea of absolute truth? What does he believe about absolute truth?
So he doesn't think it's unattainable.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Yeah, because he's a sophist.
Yeah, to a sophist, right? Absolute truth is unknowable, right? But then what does math give you?
Concrete.
Yeah, it gives you absolute concrete truths, right? Yeah, there is a right and a wrong answer. Right? 2 plus 2 has a right answer and a wrong answer.
Right.
There's a right and a wrong way to calculate the area of a field, right? There's a right and wrong way to do an average. So even if you follow, different methods, as long as they're the correct methods, right, you'll always come to the same answer. So not only is he arguing that there are other disciplines that traffic in discourse, right? But he's also reminding Gorgias that there is such a thing as absolute truth. Even if you don't believe in it. So, what's Gorgias's next, more specific definition of it? So we've noticed, right, that Socrates keeps whittling Gorgias's definition down, right?
Mm-hmm.
He starts with, like, the definition ends up being kind of funnel-shaped, right? We start with something really, really broad that's anything to do with discourse. It's like, well, no, it's affected only through discourse. Well, so is this other thing. Well, no, it's discourse that does this, right? So he's getting Gorgias to be more and more specific. He's cutting down into smaller and smaller chunks what Gorgias's art actually does. What is Gorgias's next response as to what rhetoric is or what it does. I will give you a little bit of help. You will find it near the middle of page 125.
This is where I wrote in, because he was saying about persuading like the judges in the court and in law. And so rhetoric is the art of a con man.
Yeah, I think like you're not that far off there, right? That seems to be kind of where Socrates is leading Gorgias, right? Let's read what Gorgias says here together about this. Rachel, can you read for us, starting with that good Socrates, which is truly the greatest?
What?
Middle of 125, yep.
The good Socrates, which is the greatest, being that which gives to men freedom, is their own persons, and to individuals the power of ruling over others in several states, in their several states.
And what would you consider this to be?
A democracy?
No, that's what Socrates asked. You just keep reading.
That's a rhetorical question.
Where is their greater? What is their greater? Middle of page 120. Yeah. And what would you consider this to be? What is there greater than the word?
What is there greater than the word to persuade the judges in the court, or the senators in the council, or the citizens in the assembly, or at any other political meeting? If you have the power of uttering this word, you will have a physician.
Mm-hmm.
Physician your slave, and the trainer your slave, and the trainer your slave,
Mm-hmm.
and the moneymaker of whom you talk will be found to gather treasures, not for himself, but for you who are able to speak and persuade the multitude.
Okay, thank you. So, Rylan, this is what you found creepy? And what's troubling about this definition? What is he suggesting rhetoric gives to people?
Basically, believable lies. That's what it's saying. Something that people fall for.
Yeah, well, does he actually say anything about lying here, though? He doesn't say anything about lying, right? But he does say that what rhetoric gives you is power over other people, right?
Right.
Whether you're telling the truth or lying, right? What it gives you is power to make other people do what you want.
The ability to influence.
That's what I'm like. I mean, the whole thing, I feel like Socrates is not, I don't think he's intentionally doing it, but he's getting Gorgias to contradict himself.
Oh, no, he is intentional. He is doing that.
And so, like, later
Yeah.
on, when Gorgias is like ranting, he's going to like contradict himself through the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Especially this part right here where he said
Yeah.
that he gives you power over people.
Yeah, I noticed that because he'll kind of ask general questions, and then he goes into these long explanations or answers, and I'm like,
Yeah.
what are you doing?
Well, and as we've noted too, when Socrates gets wordy too, even though the examples are probably kind of boring for us to read through, right? They're always pointed in some way, right? He's choosing the examples that he uses with Gorgias very carefully to make particular and often subtle points. And Gorgias often doesn't see the point that Socrates is trying to make, right? So the mutually agreeable definition they arrive on at the bottom of page 125, right, is that rhetoric is the artificer of persuasion, having this and no other business, and that this is her crown and end. Do you know any other effect of rhetoric over and above that of producing persuasion? Gorgias responds, no. The definition seems to me very fair, Socrates, for persuasion is the chief end of rhetoric. Then hear me, Gorgias, for I am quite sure that if there ever was a man who entered on the discussion of a matter from a pure love of knowing the truth, I am such a one, and I should say the same of you. What is coming, Socrates, So, Gorgias is starting to catch on here, right? That Socrates is making an ass out of him, right? I will tell you, I am very well aware that I do not know what, according to you, is the exact nature, or what are the topics of that persuasion of which you speak and which is given by rhetoric, although I have a suspicion about both one and the other. And I am going to ask, what is this power of persuasion which is given by rhetoric, and about what? But why, if I have a suspicion, do I ask instead of telling you? Not for your sake, but in order that the argument may proceed in such a manner as is most likely to set forth the truth. Do we notice a particular word that Socrates uses a lot? Truth. Yeah. He's harping on truth all the time here, right? And I would have you observe that I am right in asking this further question. If I asked, what sort of a painter is Zeuxis, and you said, the painter of figures, should I not be right in asking what kind of figures and where do you find them? Certainly. And the reason for asking this second question would be that there are other painters besides who paint many other figures? True. But if there had been no one but Zeuxis who painted them, then you would have answered very well. Quite so. Now I want to know about rhetoric in the same way. Is rhetoric the only art which brings persuasion, or do other arts have the same effect? I mean to say, does he who teaches anything persuade men of that which he teaches or not? So what's the question Socrates asks here? What does he want to know?
Is it like any subject that we learn is involved? Like getting knowledge is persuasion?
Yeah, that the act of teaching itself involves persuasion, right? Yeah. Like, if I want you guys to learn something, right? I have to persuade you to show up for class. I have to persuade you to do the assignments, right? Right? Grades being one means I have of persuading you.
Yeah.
And I have to persuade you that what I have to teach is worth knowing, right? So every negotiation in this classroom, every discussion in this classroom is on some level an act of persuasion. And that's what Socrates is pointing out here, that the teaching is all about persuading your students to accept what it is you are offering. Now this is important largely because of, what Gorgias says near the end of this excerpt about teachers and the relationship between teachers and students. But he concedes here that teaching is a form of persuasion. And if you go to page 127, bless you.
Yeah.
Can I get two of you to read here? Can I get a Gorgias and a Socrates?
I'll be Gorgias.
Okay, Grace be Gorgias, Rylan be Socrates.
Okay, where are we starting?
You are going to start with, then let me raise another question near the top of the page.
There's a line and line.
Yep, oh yes, right, there are line numbers.
Then let me raise another question. There's such a thing as having learned,
Yes.
and there's also having believed.
Yes.
And is the having learned the same as having believed? And are learning and belief the same things?
In my judgment, Socrates, they're not the same.
And your judgment is right, as you may ascertain in this way. If a person were to say to you, is there, which is a false belief as well as a truth? You reply, if I am not mistaken, that there is.
Yes.
Well, but is there a false knowledge as well as a truth?
No.
No, indeed. And this again proves that knowledge and belief differ.
Very true.
And yet those who have learned as well as those who have believed are persuaded.
Just so.
So we can assume two sorts of persuasion, one which is the source of belief without knowledge, as the other is of knowledge.
By all means.
And which sort of persuasion does rhetoric create in courts of law and other assemblies about the just and unjust, the sort of persuasion which gives belief without knowledge, or that which gives knowledge?
Clearly, Socrates, that which only gives belief.
Then rhetoric, as would appear, is the artificer of persuasion which creates belief about the just and unjust, but gives no instruction about them.
True.
And the rhetorician does not instruct the courts of law or other assemblies about things just and unjust, but he creates belief about them, for no one can be supposed to instruct such a vast multitude about such high matters in a short time.
Certainly not.
Okay, so you guys can stop there. Thank you very much.
I love the attitude.
Yeah.
That was great.
Way to play being backed into a corner there. So, what's the binary that's at the center of this conversation here? What are the two opposing ideas that Socrates sets up?
Belief and knowledge.
Yeah, belief and knowledge, right? And how is he suggesting belief and knowledge are different?
I guess he said that like knowledge is of like the concrete, the absolute. What he
Yeah.
arguing on belief is just without knowledge. I really like faith, like a question mark, like
Uh-huh.
without having the concrete.
Yeah, knowledge is true whether you believe it or not, right? When he's talking about knowledge, he is talking about things that are absolutely concretely true. You're very good. And when he's talking about belief, right, he says there can be a false belief as well as a true, yes? And Gorgias agrees. So belief is falsifiable. And which of these are they both admitting rhetoric produces? Belief or knowledge? Only belief, right? Yeah. Rhetoric can only produce belief. And the example that Socrates uses is once again important here. What's the example situation he creates here when talking about the difference between belief and knowledge? Where does he situate the rhetorician arguing about belief and knowledge?
Like in the courts of law.
In the courts of law, yes. So what is he suggesting about how rhetoric works in a law court?
That is also falsifiable.
Yeah,
Right, it's meant to falsify.
yeah. So
Persuade you to believe the false.
So rhetoric is not necessarily the handmaiden of justice, right?
Yeah.
That in fact, this, this is the, we're not just talking about math and gymnastics here now, right? We're talking about stuff that's really important. This is, we're talking about, potentially people's lives and freedom here, right? And you can use this art to create belief, but not instruction about what's just and unjust, right? So, yeah, things are starting to get dangerous here. Now, to follow on this, Socrates asks, "Come then, and let us see what we really mean about rhetoric. For I do not know what my own meaning is as yet. When the assembly meets to elect a physician or a shipwright or any other craftsman, will the rhetorician be taken into counsel? Surely not. For at every election he ought to be chosen who is most skilled. And again, when walls have to be built or harbors or docks to be constructed, not the rhetorician but the master workman will advise. Or when generals have to be chosen and an order of battle arranged or a proposition taken, then the military will advise and not the rhetoricians. What do you say, Gorgias? Since you profess to be a rhetorician and a maker of rhetoricians, I can do no better than to learn the nature of your art from you." So, what's Socrates saying here about these different kind of positions in civic life, right? If the assembly needs advice about medicine, who should they be consulting?
The physicians, they don't ask the rhetorician.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you ask an actual doctor.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Same thing, if you want to rebuild the city walls, right? You don't ask the rhetoricians, you go to the stonemasons, yeah. The people who actually, and this is something like Socrates actually was a stonemason, that was his profession. So this is something he knows, right? So what Socrates is arguing here is that knowledge matters, right? Expertise matters. And then Gorgias, a little further down, on page 128, bottom of the last paragraph here. Can I get somebody to read this, starting with "A marvel indeed, Socrates"? Anybody? Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
A marvel indeed, Socrates, he only knew how rhetoric comprehends and holds under her sway all the inferior arts. Let me offer you a striking example of this. On several occasions, I have been with my brother Rhetoricus or some other physician to see one of his patients who would not allow the physician to give him medicine or apply a knife or hot iron to him. And I have persuaded him to do for me what he would not do for the physician just by the use of rhetoric. And I say that if a rhetorician and physician were to go to any city and have them to argue in ecclesia or any other assembly as to which of them should be elected state physician, the physician would have no chance, but he who could speak would be chosen if he wished. And in a contest with a man of any other profession, the rhetorician more than anyone would have the power of getting himself chosen, for he could speak more persuasively to the multitude than any of them, and on any subject. Such is the nature and power of the art of rhetoric.
Good. Thank you. You can stop there, right? So he starts with a fairly harmless example here, right? What's the example Gorgias gives here, the power of rhetoric first?
The physician.
He was his brother, he persuaded him to take the medicine.
Yeah, so my brother's a doctor, right? Yeah, sometimes his patients won't accept treatment, right? They won't take their medicine, they won't let him perform surgery. But if I sit down and talk to them, then they will, right? So he's arguing that for that reason, rhetoric is a superior art to medicine, right? Does this example actually prove his point?
Not necessarily.
I don't think so.
Because some people can be like, I don't care what you say, I'm not taking the medicine.
Well, that's what Gorgias is saying, is that he can get around that resistance, right? But Herodotus can't. Because Herodotus is just a doctor armed with knowledge, not a rhetorician armed with the power of speech, right? I think if we come at this from a different direction, right? Should Gorgias be giving people medical advice without Herodotus around?
No.
God, no, right?
Go kill somebody.
Yeah. Yeah, that's like letting Jenny McCarthy advise you about vaccines, right? Like, this is not... You know, what do all these doctors know? She's a B-movie actress.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so the point here that Gorgias is trying to prove is that rhetoric is superior to medicine, but in fact what he is proving is that it's subordinate to medicine, right? He can only responsibly convince people to do what Herodotus would have them do, because Herodotus knows what he's doing. Now, the scarier example is the one about the election for the state physician, right? Who would you want, who would we want our Surgeon General to be?
Someone that just knows how to persuade people from their
Yeah, a real doctor. Yeah. Again, knowledge is important, right? Expertise is important. These things matter. While it may be possible for a rhetorician to get himself elected state physician, if he knows fuck all about medicine, it's going to be a disaster, right?
Right.
So there's another indirect point here being made about democracy. Right? Plato regards democracy as being especially susceptible to these kinds of swings in public opinion, right?
Deception, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Democracy is government based on opinion and based on belief, and not on knowledge and fact.
So if you can skewer the belief, then you can...
Yeah. And I am, by the way, not saying that I agree with this. I'm not trying to convince you all that democracy is bad, right? And that, we should all live in a dictatorship.
Revolution.
No, so, just before you put me on any watch lists, let me just, let me just make that clear. What I am trying to do here is read Plato sympathetically, right?
Right.
We're going through Plato and looking at the arguments the way he intended them to be taken, the way he intends them to be constructed, right? So let's continue with this after this problematic passage about the nature and power of the art of rhetoric. Because this last bit is really kind of where Gorgias once and for all gives away the game. And yet, Socrates, rhetoric should be used like any other competitive art, not against everybody. The rhetorician ought not to abuse his strength any more than a pugilist or pancratiatist or other master of fence, because he has powers which are more than a match either for friend or enemy. He ought not therefore to strike, stab, or slay his friends. Suppose a man to have been trained in the palestra and to be a skillful boxer. He, in the fullness of his strength, goes and strikes his father or mother or one of his familiars or friends. But that is no reason why the trainers or fencing masters should be held in detestation or banished from the city. Surely not. For they taught their art for a good purpose, to be used against enemies and evildoers, in self-defense, not in aggression, and others have perverted their instructions and turned it to a bad use their own strength and skill. But not on this account are the teachers bad, neither is the art in fault, or bad in itself. I should rather say that those who make a bad use of the art are to blame.
So that rhetoric is like, it can be used for personal interest, whereas knowledge cannot. Knowledge is fact.
Oh, I think that both Gorgias and Socrates would both concede that you can use knowledge for personal gain as well, right?
He said that it's more neutral, like
Yeah.
used for good or bad. It doesn't have like a set.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Gorgias is suggesting that rhetoric is a morally neutral tool. However, it's also important, I think, here to note what he compares rhetoric to. Do you guys know what pugilism is?
It's like boxing.
Boxing, yeah. So if he's comparing it to things like boxing, if he's comparing rhetoric to things like boxing and fencing, what is he comparing it to?
Fighting.
Yeah. Rhetoric is like fighting.
Combat.
Yeah. And fighting for sport, right?
Right.
And if a student abuses what he's been taught, then the teacher should not be held responsible, right? That's Gorgias' point of view, right? So if I teach you guys how to write persuasive essays, and one of you goes and writes a newspaper editorial arguing that we should, arguing that we should like fire nuclear missiles at Iran, right? And the president reads it and says, "Oh, this is a good idea," and punches in the code of the nuclear football, and boom, there goes Iran, right? Is it my fault that you did that? From Gorgias' point of view, no, right? What about from Socrates' point of view? What has Gorgias already conceded about teaching? What is teaching a form of?
Like representation or reflection.
Well, what's the thing that rhetoric is almost exclusively concerned with?
Persuasion.
That teaching's a form of persuasion, right? And if persuasion is so powerful, if the word that persuades is so powerful, then how can the teacher not persuade his students to make good use of the art which they are being taught, right?
Right.
Now, Socrates also believes there's something rotten at the very core of rhetoric, right? Because it only deals with belief and manipulating belief. And that this lack of any solid foundation in knowledge is the core problem both with rhetoric and with democracy, which he regards as kind of related diseases. Okay, so we're about out of time here. Do you guys have any questions about any of this?
I think this is the part like what we're reading right now. This is the part where I was talking about when he was saying how he was explaining that rhetoric was like having power over people.
Yeah.
Like, this is where he like contradicting himself.
Absolutely.
You're not supposed to abuse the power. Then you say that's
But that's exactly what rhetoric gives you, right?
Right.
is the power to make the physician and the trainer and the moneymaker your slave. But you shouldn't do that, right?
Right, but it sounds enticing, doesn't it?